Because I am pulling in the knowledge and wisdom of an Indigenous artist, I want to first acknowledge that we are on Indigenous lands. For those in Chicago and the greater region, this area is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities. This land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples, specifically the Council of Three Fires and the Illinois Confederacy, amongst many other nations. To provide some framing early on, I want to dig into some language sharing and question collecting to ground us in the creative annotating of archives as an arts practice. Archives are a collection of historical documents or records that provide information about places, people, culture, institutions, and events. Annotating, or to annotate, is the adding of notes, text, drawings, images to provide an explanation or a comment. Some of the questions we're exploring in this project include: what role do archives play in our histories and how they're told? What perspectives, ideas, or values are held within traditional archives? Whose stories and histories are told and by whom? How do we keep a record of those histories and those stories in ways that honor and respect the cultures by which they come from? How can we disrupt narratives and stories held in archives that are inaccurate, harmful, or perpetuate stereotypes? How do we archive in our everyday lives? And what do our personal archives say about who we are as people? Traditional archives have for generations been places of push-out, rendering the stories of too many on the margins of mainstream and dominant cultures invisible. They have taken our pictures, distorted our stories, made their own narratives, and genocided us out of the halls of history. Images, like text, tell a story, and archives are full of texts and images and materials that are rooted in bias and oppression that maintain the subjugation of vulnerable communities. What narratives are taught and told of the Japanese internment camps? What stories of Blackness and being are recorded that are not situated in the amplification of imagery of Black death? How do we create spaces for joy and subtlety in our histories? How do we make the record of everyday being, the mundane, meaningful, and rich in its record? For many communities, including young people, whose rich histories are left out or poorly depicted in traditional archives, using archives as a place to understand and tap into the past is not commonplace. Why would it be? Archives have historically only been accessible to elite institutions, museums, and those with the privilege and means to access them. Is it possible then that in reclaiming our records, reclaiming our stories, our histories, while reimagining archives, that we can begin to disrupt in a way that can mend the social wounds that have been created by the absence of records, including those of lynchings, transgender narratives, the differently abled, police brutality, or Black, Brown, and Indigenous student activism? It is possible, and it's happening. Black and brown women-led archival projects are reclaiming and restoring what white, heteronormative, patriarchal, revisionist history tried to destroy and take from us. For example, Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective preserves Chicanx and Latinx histories. The Equality Archives, Not Your Mammy, an archive that retells history through the voices of enslaved Black women. Equal Justice Initiative's Community Remembrance Project memorializes Black men, women, and children who were lynched in Fulton County, Georgia, through soil collection. The Black Joy Archive, and many, many more. Artists also have a long tradition of interrogating and disrupting the archives, including incredible artist researchers like Wendy Red Star. Wendy was raised on the Absolute Crow Reservation in Montana, and her work is deeply informed by her cultural heritage, her multidisciplinary arts practice, and her use of research, archives, and historical narratives. Wendy Red Star's 1880 Crow Peace Delegation series features her notations about Native history, heritage, and identity handwritten on reproductions of Charles Milton Bell's photographs of Crow leaders. The original photographs were taken during a historic meeting of the Crow delegation with the U.S. government in 1880. They were there to negotiate the expansion of the Northern Pacific Railroad that was going to cut through the Crow Reservation. Shortly after these photographs were taken, they began to circulate as part of a stereotyped, commercialized, and flattened understanding of Native American leadership. Wendy Red Star's annotations offer a new script for the Crow delegation. Her bold red ink points out the rich symbolism of the men's attire, their hair, important details about their family histories, and their honored status within Crow culture. The annotation disrupts a common way of engaging with documentary portraits and photography as truthful and informative and not needing to be interrogated or contextualized beyond the depicted imagery. What Wendy's additions demonstrate is the inability of the photograph to tell a complete story. She reveals a clear and apparent white gaze. Annotation is a tool for reflection, interrogation, inquiry, and an insertion of ideas and narratives. It is simple, it is intimate, and is a deeply deliberate act. Some of you may recognize this image. It's plastered all over the south side of Chicago, in grocery stores and vacant buildings. It's come to symbolize a period of Black history in Chicago, namely in Bronzeville, during the Great Depression and the Great Migration. The image was taken by Russell Lee as part of a photography project by the federal government's Farm Security Administration. Photographers traveled the country for the FSA, documenting the struggle of the rural poor during the Great Depression, and part of the project involved documenting the Great Migration of African Americans to Chicago from the rural South. In the almost 80 years since the photograph was taken, only one of the boys has been identified. That would be the dapper gentleman in the center, Spencer Lee Reedus. Spencer Lee's daughter, Claudia, shared that her father remembered the day like this. I was going to the show on Easter Sunday, and a white man approached me to ask if he could take a picture of me and these other boys. That was close to 50 years after the photo was taken, and the other children in the photograph have never been identified. No story to tell, invisible symbols, erased histories. Through this project, we will fall down the rabbit hole of our own personal, family, and community archives. Specifically, we'll look at images, photographs, in our own collections and grapple with who is telling our story, what is missing, why is it missing, whose perspectives are represented, what traditions, historical events, and voices do our photographs and our records show. How can a deep personal dive into our records, into the record of our lives, move those parts of us that exist on the margins into the center of our stories and our understandings of our identity? Students will use an image of their choice, ideally an original photograph for source. Photographs can be of people, places, they can be portraits, photographs of architecture or events. Ideally, students will work in black and white photographic images. However, if there is some draw for students to use color photography, modifications will and should be made to accommodate the student's exploration. Images will be annotated in the color of the student's choosing. Once completed, students will identify a relevant archive to submit the annotated image to for archiving, in addition to participating in the creation of a school-based archive. Lastly, these annotated archival images will serve to preserve and share students' stories, their experiences, along with disrupting archives by infusing non-traditional media and narratives into collections, and to build connection between people, places, history, and spaces of record that can create a more just and compassionate and inclusive record of our lives. Thank you very much.